If you're familiar with the Bible, then you no doubt know the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. If you grew up in church like me, I can remember in Sunday school as a kid, the flannel graph lesson. And kids today, I guess, would have a video of it of some sort. I don't know what they had before the flannel graph. But sometimes that's the problem, is that we're so familiar with the passage, and especially if we learned about it as a child, and the lesson was something basic and general, true, but maybe not the underlying fundamental lesson, part of the big context there as you work through the book, like I like to do. And so that's what I want to look at the next couple videos, a couple lessons from this passage for the disciples and for us as well. In Mark chapter 6, I'm going to be using Mark's account, and verse 35, it says, "When it grew late, Jesus' disciples came to him and said, 'This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them, the people, away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat.' But Jesus answered them, 'You give them something to eat.' And they said to him, 'Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth, 200 days' wages worth of bread, and give it to them to eat?' Well, we know what happened. There's the little boy with the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and Jesus multiplies that to feed 5,000 plus people. That's just the men, let alone the women and children. And there's more left over than when they started. So we know that, but why did it happen? What was the lesson Jesus wanted the disciples to learn? Because there certainly was one, more than one, I think. And what's he want us to learn as well? Well, when you're asking those type of fundamental underlying, theme questions, I always encourage you to look for a key verse. And in this one, I believe it's in verse 37, where Jesus says, "You give them something to eat." That turns things around. Okay, they've been there a long time. The people are hungry. The disciples are pointing it out. Hey, Jesus, might want to quit teaching. People are hungry. They need something to eat. Send them away. And Jesus says, "You give them something." And right there, you get their response. Okay, should we go buy that? Do we, look to see how much money we have? Probably not that much. Do we take up a collection? Did Jesus want them to buy food? No, that wouldn't be much of a lesson. Anyone can do that. There was something else he wanted them to do. There's something else he wanted them to learn. Like I say, we're going to look at the first one today. And what that lesson is where God guides, he provides. Wherever God guides us, he will provide what we need. I'm building a set of speakers, and not because I'm such a great speaker builder or even woodworker, but my audio taste far exceed my audio budget, and it's cheaper. And so I decided on the kind of speaker I wanted, and there's different types, and and then you get different drivers. Well, I ordered this one particular driver, and it needed some bolts, some very specific bolts to attach to another piece, and they weren't provided. I've been guided in a sense to this situation in terms of I wanted a speaker, I wanted this kind, I wanted this brand of this driver, I ordered it from this distributor and got this one particular box. Usually there's bolts, this one didn't have any. Where I was guided, it wasn't provided. Well, that never happens with God. Where God guides, he provides. And that's the first lesson Jesus wanted the disciples to learn here. And you can see this, the other way you get this underlying lesson, the key way is the context. And it's interesting in Mark that this event comes right after the disciples, the apostles, the 12, return from the mission where Jesus sends them out 2 by 2 to preach about the kingdom and heal and cast out demons. And so it says in verse 30, right before this, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. And it doesn't give any details, but there had been the details up before, earlier in the chapter, in verse 8. And what was really interesting when he sent them out was Jesus charged them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not put on 2 tunics. They would often put on 2, one to wear during the day, another to sleep under at night. Jesus says, don't take any of these extras. You need shoes, okay. You need 1 tunic, you need a staff, no money, no extra food, none of that. No bag even, the things that would carry some extras. And the lesson from that was he wanted them to trust God would provide. God would always provide a place for them to stay, a house that would provide them food, and whatever they needed for this mission, God would provide because he had clearly guided them to it. Jesus said, go there. Well, he wants them to learn the same thing here. God had clearly guided them to this situation where there were 5,000 plus people and they were hungry. It's interesting, when they return from that mission, Jesus knows they're tired from that, and he says, you need to go to a desolate place and rest. And so they do. But even though it starts off desolate, it doesn't stay that way, because the people see Jesus, they're always following him, and when they land in their boat, there the people are, and it says Jesus had compassion on them, and he began to teach them. And then not only that, it says, I thought this was interesting, he taught them many things. If he just taught them a few things, well, good. They could have gotten that lesson, those few lessons, and moved on, got some food. But here it is, now it's late, they're in a desolate place. God had guided them to this situation clearly, and Jesus wanted them to learn what they should have learned from the mission. He wanted them to apply that lesson now. Where God guides, he provides. Trust him. That's the key. It was the key to their mission, not just what they were saying, but them learning to trust in God as they did that mission, as they spread that message. And so it tells us this in Philippians. My God will supply every need of yours according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus. Whatever our true need is, and if God guides us to a situation, whatever we need for that situation, God will provide according to his riches, not just out of, but in proportion to, and God's pretty rich. Well, there's a lesson that goes hand in hand with this, not the second lesson, but one that, when you know the fact, where God guides, he provides. And when I come to believe that, well, then belief should always lead to faith, to trust, to acting on that when I'm in a situation that requires it. And so that's really the lesson. Don't just learn it, but begin to trust. Where God guides, he provides. Now, I always like to qualify this, because in our culture I have to qualify this. I trust God will provide, but he'll provide what he wants, how he wants, and boy, the key one is when he wants. Sometimes okay, God, you guided me here. Now here's what I want. Here's how I'd like you to do it. And definitely the when is always now. No, we have to trust him in all those ways. Matter of fact, we just have to trust him. I talk often about trusting in God versus trusting that something will happen. Well, we can trust that God will provide because he's promised us that. But beyond that, the details are up to him. So I really just need to trust in him. And I always say, trust that he's in control and he loves me. Where God guides, he provides. Now, one other thought came to mind. I want to share that because it's helped me. God's guidance is not always as overt. It's interesting for the disciples. Jesus told them, go out in twos. Here's where you go, Very clear. In this situation, it wasn't as clear. He didn't come out and say, look for a way for God to miraculously provide. But God had guided them to that situation nonetheless. They should have trusted that. Same thing's true for us. Some situations will be very clear. God has put you here. Others, it just seems like things have happened. They can't see as many providential things. And in one sense, there's nothing happens that God doesn't allow. So he's allowed us to be in whatever situation we're in. In that sense, he's guided us to it. He doesn't cause everything, but he's guided us. So I can trust him always, not just when it's very clear, God, you brought me here, but God, you've allowed me to be here. You'll provide what I need. We can make some bad choices of situations we go into, and God's provision will still be there. In some sense, it doesn't mean there won't be consequences for our choices and actions. God will provide what we truly need in his way, his timing, all of that. Trust him. Tell you, this is one thing that has helped me quite a bit. Helped me at times not to worry in a situation. Helped me at times bring me back from worry to a sense of peace because I can trust him. So this was an important lesson for the disciples. It's an important lesson for us, Jesus' disciples today. Follow up with the action steps to help ingrain it even further. We'll look at the second lesson next time.